Can I ask you about, you were talking about adaptation, and I know adaptation is what practical action is helping to do in many developing countries. So you're bringing experience from your work and partners. What is so difficult about it? Other than money, we need money on the table, and perhaps that will come at the last minute and unblock the deadlock. But when this adaptation text is being worked out, what are the problems? Is it so hard that we know, roughly speaking, the science can tell us the likely effects over, a probable time period? There's so many actions you can take. What is it that's actually being discussed? How to put sandbags on beaches or?
No, it's not the technical issues that are discussed here. That'll be for that. There's no problem about sharing those information, whether it's within the UN process or without. No, the issue is that actually adaptation isn't that straightforward. The science is not clear. So what adaptation is about is living under uncertainty. Okay?
Yes,
so
yeah.
There's a challenge for that. Governments don't know how to do it. And certainly communities don't. We've got what's called an adaptation deficit at the community level because there's a huge deficit on the amount of development expenditure that should have been undertaken. We're a long way from meeting the Millennium Development Goals, for example. So you've got people who are underfed, who have very poor access to resources, who have poor health and limited education, and then throwing the challenge of climate change at them. So that's a huge challenge. And so, we try and meet it, we try and indicate how that might be met. But so that's one challenge. The other challenge is the money, and the decisions are made here, as you said, by governments. Governments, the reason poor people are poor is because their governments actually don't do much for them.
Okay, that's a sobering thought. And Jeffrey Allen may have another comment or question.
Yeah, another question about adaptation. I think a lot of people are trying to want to know, how is all this money going to be split up? Adaptation money I'm talking about, is it split up based on population? Does a particular country get more money because they've got a higher population? Is it split up based on a higher threat level to certain countries? How is all that giant pool of money divided among the vulnerable countries?
Well, that is something that has been a real bone of contention here. That's one of the issues, because under the convention there was certain clear language on most vulnerable countries. In the Bali Action Plan, those most vulnerable countries were identified as the least developed countries, the small island developing states, and African countries prone to drought and flood. Since then there have been added countries with vulnerable mountainous ecosystems, melting glaciers, for example. But then you've got situations where you've got developing countries which are better off, so it looks like they're not the most vulnerable because they have a capacity to deal with it, yet within those countries there are highly vulnerable populations or ecosystems, and they're wanting a share of the pie, and at the moment the pie is minuscule, so it's a battle about nothing at the moment. So we've seen language drop out about listing the most vulnerable countries and just listing developing countries that are vulnerable. So that is a huge challenge in terms of climate justice, and and we had really wanted that it's the most vulnerable populations in the most vulnerable countries that get the resources. That's totally gone, because
it's not even in a square bracket.
The developing country governments want to see themselves as in charge of how that money is spent, and that's a real concern for not only development NGOs, anybody concerned with climate justice and indigenous peoples and so on, but also for those countries that are likely one way or another to be raising and delivering those funds, because they want those funds to deliver adaptation to those who need it most. They don't want it go to country governments to do things that those governments consider appropriate, which might be building flood-proof roads and bridges, which may be necessary, but which could easily soak up all the money.
So, not for practical action, because practical action tends to work with communities, but for NGOs who are sort of in the aid business, I don't mean that disparagingly, sort of generally, this is a slightly tricky and often not mentioned issue, because they want money for developing countries to help adapt and tackle climate change, and yet as with forests or other issues, if the money goes to governments, it may never reach, or small amounts of it may reach the communities. So it's a sort of double-edged sword, this, isn't it? Large sums of money going in, but not getting to the communities.
Yes, so we've tried to build into the text issues about stakeholder participation. And there's something in there still. But it doesn't specify who the stakeholders are and so on, whereas we had specified how we thought the text should be framed, and at the moment that's not there. We do see it as an issue for civil society to work with national governments when the money begins flowing to build their capacity about what good adaptation means, convince them that it's win-win, that if they have more capable populations, not only are they meeting humanitarian issues, but they're also improving the economy of their country. If you have more productive people, then your country is better off, and therefore build the capacity of the communities and different levels of government to be active stakeholders in the allocation of resources and the spending of those, and the monitoring as to whether the spending of those resources has actually led to adaptation.
Yes, time is squeezing us, but we've got time for one more message via Jeff. Sorry,
whoever I am. That was sort of the final question. How will this money be monitored to see, how it's actually being spent?
There's no detail in the text about that at present. I mean, we always knew that because of the squeeze process and the way the time has not been well used in the last year or two, that there will be a lot of issues for post-Copenhagen. And I think working on this will be a challenge, but I think good examples. There's another source of adaptation funds under the Kyoto Protocol with 2% levy on the Clean Development Mechanism, which is now going into the Adaptation Fund. It's small at the moment because the carbon market is so weak, but that fund has set up really strong guidance on what kind of projects and programs will be eligible and how it will be monitored. And we are looking to that fund and its projects and programs to offer models for how other adaptation funding should be allocated and spent.
Okay, I think we've got to wrap up, but I just want to ask you one thing, because to bring it home to the people on the ground here, what of the communities that Practical Action works with, which do you think provide the most sort of vivid examples? And presumably one can go and see on your website. I know you've got little sort of chapters of which ones would you pick out where the change is most vivid or is affecting people most most harshly?
Well, I suppose I would pick up two, in Bangladesh and in northern Kenya. So in Bangladesh, I think it's pretty well known that monsoon floods are becoming more frequent, they're lasting longer. So these are very marginalised people who live on the banks of road embankments as the only higher ground. They have no entitle to their land. They expect to live under very difficult circumstances for 2 or 3 weeks a year under the previous sort of normal flooding, and now we're talking about months some years. So clearly, it's impossible to live if if the water comes halfway up your house. So we're supporting them with raised plinth housing and livelihoods that you can conduct under flood conditions, like fish in cages, floating gardens on which to grow vegetables and so on. So for them, life is pretty dire. And then the pastoralists in northern Kenya, now these are people who are very well adapted to living under extremely difficult conditions, moving their livestock around to follow water, following the rains and the grass that grows during the rains. But what they're seeing is, instead of a serious drought perhaps every 7 to 10 years, it's now sort of every 2 to 3 years. So their herds of livestock don't recover in the intervening time before they're struck again with a drought. And really these communities are very remote. The road connections to the rest of Kenya are very poor. It's really very hard to see what other livelihood options they have. There isn't a market there isn't much else they can produce. There isn't really access to a market for it. So really, we see pastoralism as a livelihood way that survived for thousands of years as really under threat now.
It's under threat, and it might seem a long way away to some of us, but it's coming closer, I think, all the time. We're all going to be affected sooner or later, and perhaps we'll be able to learn from some of these early lessons.
I think we should be a bit humble and say, we will have to adapt. We will have to adapt to a much simpler lifestyle, much lower carbon, and we can learn how to be content with less. One thing that always strikes me, particularly when I visit Africa, is the warmth and the joy in people's faces who are living on extremely little. they still find things in life to be happy about. And I think we in the West, we've totally lost that. If we haven't got the latest this or that, or the extra this or that, then we get fed up.
Rachel Berger, I think we'll end it there. There's nothing I can say to that. So Rachel Berger of Practical Action, thank you very much for coming in and talking to us.